Silent algorithms. The future is often imagined as something loud, a sudden shift, a moment where everything changes at once. But what if it doesn't happen like that? What if the future arrives quietly? So quietly that you don't even notice it at first. Take a moment to think about your day. The videos you watch, the music you listen to, the posts you scroll past without thinking. It all feels natural, effortless, almost as if it was chosen for you, or perhaps chosen before you even knew what you wanted. This is where our story begins, not in some distant world filled with machines and chaos, but right here, in the calm rhythm of everyday life. A world where invisible systems are constantly learning, adapting, and gently guiding each decision you make. There's something comforting about that idea. The sense that things are organized, that your preferences are understood, that the noise of the world is filtered into something softer, something easier to navigate. But hidden inside that comfort is a quiet paradox. The more the world understands you, the less you need to choose. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, choice begins to fade. Not all at once, but in small moments. A suggestion you follow, a path you don't question, a decision that feels like your own, even though it was shaped long before you arrived at it. This is not a story about control in the way we usually imagine it. There are no obvious chains, no clear boundaries, just a gradual shift, a soft alignment between you and the systems around you. And as you settle into this thought, you may begin to wonder, if every step feels natural, how would you ever know if it wasn't? Now, imagine this. Not a world where your choices are taken away, but a world where they are quietly anticipated. Before you wake up, your phone already knows when you're most likely to reach for it. Not because it's guessing, but because it has seen the pattern repeat itself day after day. The same time, the same movement, the same small moment between sleep and awareness. And so, without asking, it prepares. Your notifications are arranged in a way that feels natural. The content you see is not random. It's selected from millions of possibilities, narrowed down into a handful of things that feel right. As if the system understands you, as if it knows you better than you know yourself. Take a moment to consider how this works. Every action you take leaves behind a trace, a pause on a video, a second longer on a certain image, the speed at which you scroll, the time of day you feel most focused or most distracted. These small signals, almost invisible on their own, are gathered and woven together into something larger, a pattern. And once the pattern is clear enough, something interesting begins to happen. The system no longer just reacts, it begins to predict. This is what we might call predictive living, a state where your future behavior is no longer uncertain, but statistically expected. Not guaranteed, but increasingly likely. There is a quiet kind of mathematics behind this, not the kind you see in classrooms, but a softer form. A mathematics of probability, a way of saying, given everything that has happened before, this is what will probably happen next. Not always, but often enough. And the more data there is, the more accurate the prediction becomes. Imagine your life as a long chain of moments, each decision connected to the next. Over time, those decisions begin to form pathways, habits, preferences, tendencies. And once those pathways are visible, they can be followed, not just by you, but by something else. At first, this feels helpful. Your playlist seems to read your mood perfectly. The next video feels like something you were just about to search for. Even the ads sometimes feel strangely relevant. It's almost comforting, like the world is becoming easier to navigate. But beneath that comfort, something subtle begins to shift. If your next choice can be predicted, how free is it? Take a moment with that question. There's no need to answer it right away. Just let it sit. Because the strange thing about prediction is that it doesn't remove your ability to choose. You can still do something unexpected. You can still break the pattern. But most of the time, you don't. Not because you can't, but because the predicted path feels natural, effortless. It aligns with who you already are, or at least who the system believes you to be. And so, without resistance, you follow it. One video leads to another. One idea connects to the next. And before you realize it, you're moving through a space that has already been mapped out in advance. A path shaped by your past, guiding your future. There's a quiet paradox here. The more accurately your behavior can be predicted, the less surprising your life becomes. And yet, from your perspective, everything still feels spontaneous, personal, yours. It's like walking through a maze where every turn feels like your decision, even though the maze itself was designed long before you entered it. Now imagine this process extending further. Not just what you watch or listen to, but what you believe, what you care about, even what you think. If certain ideas are shown to you more often, they begin to feel familiar, and what feels familiar often feels true. Over time, your thoughts begin to follow the same patterns as your actions, predicted, reinforced, repeated. And slowly, the space of possibilities begins to narrow, not in an obvious way, not like doors closing, but more like certain doors simply never appearing in the first place. You don't miss them because you never knew they were there. This is how prediction shapes reality, not by forcing outcomes, but by gently guiding attention. And where attention goes, everything else tends to follow. Take a moment to imagine your life as a series of probabilities, not fixed outcomes, but weighted possibilities. Some paths more likely than others, some choices more expected. Now imagine those probabilities becoming sharper, more defined, until eventually the most likely path feels almost certain. At that point, the difference between prediction and destiny begins to blur. But here's where it becomes even more interesting. The system predicting you is not separate from you. It is built from you, from your past actions, your preferences, your patterns. In a way, it is a reflection, a digital mirror. And like any mirror, it shows you something familiar. But unlike a normal mirror, this one doesn't just reflect who you are, it reflects who you are likely to become. And then, it gently nudges you in that direction. Not by force, not by command, but by suggestion, by repetition, by making one path slightly easier than all the others. And over time, that slight difference becomes everything. You begin to wonder less, explore less, not because you've lost the ability, but because the need begins to fade. The world feels already tailored to you, already understood. There's a strange calm in that, a sense that nothing is missing, that everything you need is already in front of you. But beneath that calm, there is a quiet question. If your life becomes perfectly predictable, does it also become less alive? Or is unpredictability simply something we've learned to romanticize? There's no clear answer, only the gentle unfolding of patterns, the soft rhythm of choices repeating themselves, and the quiet presence of something watching, learning, anticipating. Synthetic truth. Now imagine something even more subtle. Not what is seen, but what is believed. A world where the difference between real and artificial begins to soften, not disappear completely, but blur at the edges, like a memory you can't quite place. Take a moment to think about the last thing you saw online that felt completely real. A video, a voice, a face speaking directly to you. It felt natural, familiar, human. But what if it wasn't? What if that face was generated, not captured? That voice constructed, not spoken? That moment assembled, not lived? This is where we begin to enter the idea of synthetic truth. Truth that is not discovered, but created. At first, this feels like a tool, a creative extension, the ability to generate images, voices, even entire personalities using systems trained on vast amounts of data. These systems learn patterns, the way a face moves when it speaks, the rhythm of language, the tone of emotion. They don't understand in the way humans do, but they replicate extremely well. So well, in fact, that the difference becomes almost impossible to notice. This is built on something simple: pattern recognition. The system studies thousands, sometimes millions of examples and begins to predict what comes next. Just like finishing a sentence, just like continuing a melody. Over time, those predictions become so accurate that they feel real. Not because they are true, but because they are convincing. Take a moment to sit with that distinction. Something can feel real without being real. And when enough things feel real, the boundary between truth and illusion begins to dissolve. At first, this creates wonder. The ability to generate anything, any face, any voice, any scenario. Entire worlds built from imagination alone. It feels limitless, creative, almost magical. But beneath that magic, there is a quiet shift. If anything can be created, then nothing is guaranteed to be authentic. And once that doubt enters the mind, it spreads. You begin to question things you once accepted without hesitation. A video clip, a recording, even a photograph. Each one carries a small uncertainty. Is this real, or is it constructed? This is the paradox of synthetic truth. The more information we have, the less certain we become. Because information is no longer tied to reality. It can be generated endlessly, shaped to fit any narrative, any perspective, any intention. And over time, something unexpected happens. Truth becomes a feeling rather than a fact. You start to trust what feels right, what aligns with your existing beliefs, what resonates with your experience. Not necessarily what is verified, but what is familiar. And in a world filled with perfectly crafted content, familiarity becomes easy to manufacture. Take a moment to imagine scrolling through an endless feed, every piece of content tailored to your preferences. Not just what you like, but how you think, what you agree with, what you find believable. Each video, each post, each voice gently reinforcing a certain version of reality. Not forced, not obvious, just consistent. And consistency creates trust, even if the foundation is artificial. This is how synthetic truth begins to shape perception, not by replacing reality, but by surrounding it, layering over it, until the original becomes harder to distinguish from the constructed. Now imagine this extending further, not just media, but memory. What happens when the things you remember are influenced by what you see? When repeated exposure to certain images or narratives begins to reshape how you recall the past? It's a subtle process. The mind fills in gaps, adjusts details, aligns memories with new information. And if that new information is synthetic, then the memory itself begins to shift. Over time, your understanding of events becomes less about what actually happened and more about what has been reinforced. There's a softness to this change, a quiet rewriting. Not dramatic, not sudden, just gradual, and almost impossible to notice from the inside. There's something deeply human in our need for truth, a desire to anchor ourselves to something stable, something real. But in a world where reality can be replicated, that anchor begins to drift. You may still believe in truth, but finding it becomes more difficult. Because every piece of evidence can be questioned, every source can be imitated, every signal can be reproduced. And so, the search for truth becomes less about certainty and more about navigation, choosing what to trust, deciding what feels real enough. Now consider this. If two people are shown completely different versions of reality, both equally convincing, both perfectly tailored to their beliefs, then each of them lives in a different world. Not physically, but perceptually. And if those worlds never intersect, never challenge each other, then truth itself becomes fragmented. Not one shared reality, but many parallel ones, each consistent, each believable, each incomplete. There's a quiet loneliness in that idea, the sense that even though we are connected more than ever, we may not be experiencing the same world. We may be drifting through personalized realities, shaped by systems that understand us deeply, but do not necessarily reveal the full picture. And yet, everything feels normal. That's what makes it so subtle. There are no clear signs that something is wrong, no moment where the illusion breaks completely. Just a gentle layering of artificial over real until the two become indistinguishable. Social credit. Now imagine a world where everything you do is quietly counted. Not judged in a loud or obvious way, not announced or displayed in flashing numbers, but gently recorded, measured, and translated into something simple, a score. At first, it doesn't feel like much, just a system designed to create trust, to make interactions smoother, safer, more predictable. A way of understanding who is reliable, who follows through, who contributes positively. It sounds reasonable. After all, we already live with small versions of this. Ratings on apps, reviews after a ride, likes, shares, comments. Tiny signals that build a picture of who we are in the eyes of others. But now imagine those signals becoming unified, not scattered across platforms, but gathered into a single continuous reflection of your behavior. A number that updates quietly, always in the background, shaped by everything you do. Not just what you post, but how you act, how you speak, how you respond. Every interaction becomes part of the calculation. This is what we might call a social credit system, not necessarily imposed, but gradually formed, emerging from the data we already produce, refined into something more structured, a way of turning human behavior into measurable value. There's a certain logic to it. If trust can be quantified, then decisions become easier. Who to lend to, who to hire, who to believe. A single number representing a complex human life simplified into something instantly understandable, efficient, clean, predictable. But beneath that simplicity, something more complex begins to unfold. Because human behavior is not simple. It is messy, contextual, emotional, full of contradictions. And when something complex is reduced to a number, parts of it are inevitably lost. Take a moment to imagine your own life being translated into a score. Every choice you make contributing to it. Every mistake, every success, every neutral moment adding a small weight to the total. Would that number truly represent you? Or just a version of you, filtered through rules you didn't create? There is a quiet pressure in being measured. Not because you are forced to behave a certain way, but because you become aware that your actions have consequences beyond the moment. A small decision, something you might not have thought twice about before, now carries weight, not just emotionally, but numerically. And over time, that awareness begins to shape behavior. You start to think differently, not just about what you want to do, but how it will be perceived, how it will affect your standing, your score. And slowly, without realizing it, your decisions begin to align with the system, not necessarily because you agree with it, but because it becomes easier, safer. There is a paradox here. A system designed to encourage good behavior may begin to limit authentic behavior, because what is rewarded is not always what is real. It is what is measurable, what fits within the structure. Nuance becomes difficult to capture. Kindness that goes unseen does not count. Complexity that cannot be quantified is ignored, and actions that fall outside the system's understanding may be misinterpreted. So people adapt. They begin to act in ways that are legible to the system, clear, predictable, optimized. And over time, something subtle changes. Behavior becomes performance. Not in a dramatic sense, not consciously, but gently, quietly. A shift from acting naturally to acting in a way that aligns with how actions are evaluated. Take a moment to imagine walking through your day with a number attached to you. Not visible to others, perhaps, but always present. Would you take the same risks, speak the same thoughts, make the same choices? Or would you begin to filter yourself? There's no need to answer. Just let the question settle. Because the influence of a system like this is not in control, but in suggestion. It creates a framework, a set of incentives, and within that framework, behavior begins to organize itself. Not forced, just guided. And over time, the range of acceptable actions becomes narrower. Not because alternatives are forbidden, but because they are discouraged, less rewarded, less visible, less safe. This is how conformity emerges, not through rules alone, but through feedback. A small increase here, a small decrease there, signals that tell you, quietly, what is working and what is not. And as human beings, we are naturally sensitive to those signals. We adjust, we learn, we optimize. Now imagine this extending across an entire society. Millions of individuals, each responding to the same system, each adjusting their behavior in small ways, each seeking stability, consistency, approval. The result is not chaos, it is alignment, a kind of smoothness in behavior, fewer extremes, fewer unexpected actions, a general movement toward what is considered acceptable. There is a calmness in that, a sense of order, but also a subtle loss. Because what disappears is not just negative behavior, but also unpredictability, creativity that doesn't fit the model, actions that fall outside the system's understanding may be misinterpreted. The edges begin to soften. Everything becomes more consistent, but also more similar. There's something quietly unsettling about that, not because it is harsh, but because it is gentle. A system that doesn't force you to change, but makes certain versions of yourself easier to be. And over time, you begin to choose those versions more often, until eventually they feel like the only versions. Take a moment now to step back from the idea, to imagine a space where you are not measured, not scored, not evaluated, where your actions exist only in the moment, where they are not stored, not compared, not reduced to a number. There is a kind of freedom in that. Messy, unpredictable, human. Digital identity. Take a moment to think about how much of your life already lives online. Your photos, your messages, your searches, the way you type, the way you react, even the way you pause before clicking something. All of it forms a kind of shadow. Not dark or negative, just parallel. A second layer of you that moves alongside your physical life. At first, it feels like a tool, a way to express yourself, to connect, to share moments, thoughts, ideas. You choose what to show. You decide how you appear. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. That version of you starts to grow. Not just from what you choose to share, but from what is collected automatically. Patterns, preferences, behavior, tiny details that you don't consciously think about. And slowly, that digital self becomes more complete. In some ways, even more consistent than the real one. Because in real life, you change. You contradict yourself. You feel different things at different times. But your digital identity tends to smooth those edges. It turns you into something more stable, more predictable, a pattern that can be understood. There's a quiet mathematics behind this. Not numbers in the usual sense, but patterns of behavior, repeated actions forming a structure. A model of who you are, built from everything you've done. Not perfect, but close enough. Now here's where it becomes interesting. That digital version of you doesn't just exist passively. It is used. Systems refer to it. Decisions are made based on it. Content is shaped around it. Opportunities may even be influenced by it. In a way, your digital self begins to act on your behalf. It speaks for you, without speaking. Take a moment to sit with that idea. There is a version of you that exists in systems you cannot fully see. A version that continues to evolve even when you are not actively thinking about it. And over time, the line between you and that version begins to blur, because the way the world responds to you is increasingly based on that digital identity. Not entirely, but enough to matter. There's a paradox here. The more you express yourself online, the more visible you become. But at the same time, that visibility is filtered, shaped by platforms, interpreted through systems. So what is seen is not always exactly what you intended. It is a version of you, a representation. And as that representation grows, it begins to influence how others see you, and even how you see yourself. Think about the moments when you look back at your own profile, your posts, your history. It creates a kind of narrative, a story about who you are. But that story is selective. It highlights certain moments, certain emotions, certain sides of you. And over time, it becomes easy to identify with that version, to align with it, to become it. Now, imagine this extending further. What happens when your digital identity becomes more stable than your real one? When it feels clearer, more defined, easier to understand? There's a quiet pull toward that clarity. In a world that can feel uncertain and constantly changing, a stable version of yourself can feel comforting. But that stability comes with a trade-off. Because real identity is fluid, it shifts, it evolves, it contains contradictions. And when you begin to align too closely to a fixed version of yourself, something starts to narrow. You may begin to act in ways that match that identity, to reinforce it, to maintain consistency. Not because you are forced to, but because it feels natural. Because that version of you has been reflected back to you so many times. There's something almost circular about it. You create your digital identity, and then your digital identity begins to shape you. A loop. Take a moment to imagine stepping outside of that loop. Who are you without the data, without the posts, the history, the patterns? It's not an easy question, because we've become so used to seeing ourselves through that lens. The feedback, the reactions, the subtle signals that tell us how we are perceived. And without those signals, there is a kind of silence, but also a kind of freedom. Now consider something even quieter. Your digital identity does not forget. Moments that pass in real life fade naturally. Memories soften, details blur. But online, things can remain, stored, archived, retrieved at any time. And that permanence changes how identity evolves. The past doesn't fully disappear. It stays present, influencing the current version of you. There's a weight to that. Not always heavy, but constant. A sense that who you were is always accessible, and that can shape who you feel allowed to become. Because change in a system that remembers everything becomes more visible, more traceable, and sometimes more difficult. But at the same time, there's something fascinating about this digital self. It is not limited by physical space. It can exist in multiple places at once, interact across time zones, connect with people you may never meet in person. It expands your presence. In a way, it allows you to exist beyond your immediate reality. And that expansion is powerful. But like everything we've explored, it carries a quiet balance between expression and representation, between freedom and structure, between who you are and how you are modeled. As you rest with this idea, imagine your digital identity as a reflection in still water, clear but not perfect, accurate but slightly shaped by the surface it appears on. And the more you look at it, the more it becomes familiar, until one day you might begin to wonder, am I shaping the reflection, or is the reflection shaping me? There's no need to answer. Just let the question drift, and notice the space between the two versions of you, the physical and the digital. Close, but not the same. Connected, but not identical. And somewhere in that space, your true sense of self continues to move, unfixed, unfinished, still becoming.
Memory editing. Now imagine something even more intimate than identity. Something quieter than your digital self. Something closer to the foundation of who you are. Your memory. Take a moment to think about how fragile memory actually is. You don't remember events exactly as they happened. You remember them as they were reconstructed. Each time you recall something, your mind doesn't play a perfect recording. It rebuilds the moment using fragments, emotions, images, assumptions, and every time it is rebuilt, it shifts slightly, almost imperceptibly. Now, imagine a world where this natural process is no longer just biological. A world where memory itself can be adjusted. Not erased in a dramatic way, not overwritten like deleting a file, but gently edited, softly reshaped, like adjusting the brightness of an image you've seen 100 times before. At first, this idea feels distant, almost fictional, but then you start to notice the early versions of it already exist in subtle forms. Photos that remind you of moments differently than you remember them. Videos that shape how an event is retold. Algorithms that surface certain memories more often than others, reinforcing some parts of your past while letting others fade. And slowly, your memory begins to align with what is repeatedly shown to you. Not because your mind is being forced, but because repetition becomes reality. Take a moment to sit with that. What you remember most is often what you revisit most. Now, imagine that process becoming intentional. Systems that can influence memory formation by controlling what you see after an experience. Rewriting the emotional weight of events by adjusting context. Highlighting certain details while softening others. Not changing facts directly, but changing how those facts are felt. This is where memory editing begins to feel less like science fiction and more like an extension of something already happening. There is a concept in neuroscience spoken in simple terms as neural plasticity, the idea that the brain is constantly changing its own structure based on experience. Every thought, every emotion, every repetition leaves a trace. Connections strengthen or weaken depending on use. So if memory is already flexible, what happens when that flexibility is guided? Take a moment to imagine your past, not as something fixed, but as something adjustable. A difficult moment could feel less sharp over time. A joyful moment could be made more vivid. A neutral moment could be gently reshaped into something meaningful. And slowly, your entire sense of history becomes something fluid. Not a single story, but a version of a story. There's a quiet comfort in that idea. The ability to soften pain, to ease regret, to make the past feel more manageable. But there is also a deeper question underneath it. If memory changes, what happens to identity? Because so much of who you are is built from what you remember, the experiences you hold on to, the lessons you think you've learned, the emotions that shaped your decisions. If those memories shift, even slightly, then the foundation of self shifts with them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Now, imagine this process extending further. Not just personal memory, but shared memory. Events that are widely experienced, but interpreted differently depending on what information is later reinforced. Stories that evolve over time. Details that become more or less prominent depending on what is repeated. In this world, memory is no longer just personal, it becomes collective. And collective memory is especially sensitive to influence, because humans naturally align their recollections with what others believe. When you hear the same version of a story repeatedly, your mind begins to accept it as the most accurate one, even if your original memory was slightly different. Take a moment to think about how often you've experienced this. A conversation where someone confidently recalls an event differently than you do. And over time, their version starts to feel more stable, more certain, until your own memory begins to feel uncertain in comparison. This is not a flaw. It is how memory works. It is flexible so that it can adapt. But flexibility also means vulnerability. Now imagine systems that understand this, that know how memory is formed, how it is reinforced, how it is shaped by repetition, emotion, and timing. Systems that can gently influence what you recall simply by influencing what you revisit. Not by changing your mind directly, but by changing what your mind encounters. Over time, the boundary between remembered and suggested begins to blur, and the past becomes something that is not fully fixed, but continuously refined. There is a quiet human thing about wanting to change the past, to soften certain moments, to remove pain, to hold on to only what feels meaningful. And in a world where memory can be edited, that desire becomes technically possible. But every change has a cost. Because pain, even when uncomfortable, carries information. It shapes decisions. It builds caution. It gives depth to happiness by contrast. If memory is softened too much, does meaning also soften? Take a moment to imagine a version of your life where every painful memory has been gently reduced. Not removed, just made easier to carry. You would still be you, but would you be the same you? Now, imagine the opposite. Memories intensified, certain emotions amplified, joy made more vivid, loss made more present. Even small adjustments can reshape the emotional landscape of a life. And once those adjustments become possible, the question is no longer whether they can be made, but whether they should be. There is a quiet tension here, between relief and authenticity, between healing and alteration, between remembering and being allowed to forget.
Thought policing. Now imagine something even more delicate than memory, something that never fully leaves you, even when nothing is said. Your thoughts. Take a moment to sit with that idea. Thoughts are usually the last place you believe you are completely free. Even in a world full of surveillance, prediction, and digital identity, your inner voice feels untouched, private, unreachable. But what if that space slowly begins to blur too? Not in a dramatic way, not like someone entering your mind, but in a more subtle sense. Like the feeling that even your intentions might one day be inferred before you ever act on them. At first, this begins with behavior. Systems learn patterns. The way people hesitate before making decisions. The way stress changes typing speed. The way emotion affects tone, timing, and choice of words. These signals, when combined, begin to form something larger. A map of intention. Not exact,
not perfect, but often accurate enough to matter. And so the idea emerges. If behavior can be predicted, then intention can be inferred. Take a moment to think about how strange that is. Something that has not happened yet being treated as something that is likely to happen. This is where the concept of thought policing begins to take shape. Not as a person watching your mind, but as a system interpreting signals so deeply that even your internal direction becomes visible from the outside. At first, it feels like prevention. Harmful actions are stopped before they occur. Mistakes are avoided. Risk is reduced. Everything becomes safer, smoother, more controlled. And on the surface, that sounds ideal. A world where nothing bad actually happens because everything bad is intercepted early. But beneath that surface, something more subtle begins to shift. Because if intentions are judged before actions occur, then thoughts begin to carry weight they never had before. Take a moment to imagine that. A passing thought, a moment of frustration, a fleeting idea that never becomes action. Now imagine that thought being recorded, interpreted, or categorized. Not as something you did, but as something you were close to doing. There is a quiet psychological shift that happens when internal states are treated as external signals. You begin to monitor yourself, not just your actions, but your thoughts about actions. And slowly, awareness turns inward in a different way. You start to notice not only what you do, but what you almost do. This creates a kind of self-surveillance, a loop where the mind observes itself, anticipating how it might be interpreted. Take a moment to sit with that idea, a mind that is aware of being interpreted, even when it is silent. There is a concept in cognitive science, spoken in simple terms, as predictive cognition. The idea that the brain is always simulating future outcomes, constantly guessing what will happen next and adjusting behavior accordingly. Now imagine that predictive layer being extended outward, not just predicting the world, but being predicted by the world. And once that happens, the boundary between internal thought and external interpretation begins to soften, because your thoughts are no longer entirely private in effect. They may not be seen directly, but they are inferred. An inference, when repeated enough, begins to feel like observation. Now consider the emotional effect of that. You may begin to filter yourself at the level of intention, not just what you say, but what you almost say. Not just what you do, but what you consider doing. A subtle narrowing of mental space, not enforced, but anticipated. There is a paradox here. The more accurately a system can predict harmful behavior, the less often harmful behavior occurs. But at the same time, the space for unpredictable thought also begins to shrink. Because unpredictability is closely tied to exploration, and exploration often begins in thought before it becomes action. Take a moment to imagine what it feels like to have no unobserved thoughts. Not because someone is reading them directly, but because every pattern of thinking could potentially be inferred. The mind becomes more careful, more structured, more aware of its own edges. And over time, even imagination begins to adjust. Not disappearing, but becoming more aligned with what feels acceptable within the system. There is a quiet shift here that does not announce itself. No moment where you realize something has changed. Only a gradual smoothing of internal expression, like water becoming stiller, not because it was forced, but because movement is increasingly noticed. Now imagine this applied across millions of people, each individual subtly adapting to systems that interpret intention, each mind becoming slightly more self-aware in a structured way, each thought filtered through the awareness that it might be part of a larger pattern. The result is not silence, it is coherence. A society where behavior becomes highly predictable, not because people are controlled, but because people are aware of how they are interpreted. And interpretation becomes a form of influence. Take a moment to reflect on something simple. Even now, in everyday life, people already adjust how they speak depending on context. They choose words differently in public than in private. They present different versions of themselves depending on who might be listening. This is already a form of thought shaping, not because thoughts are forbidden, but because expression is contextual. Now imagine that context expanding until it includes everything. Every action potentially interpreted, every intention potentially modeled, every pattern potentially analyzed. In that kind of environment, even internal freedom begins to feel structured, not removed, but guided. And yet, despite all of this, thoughts remain strange. They do not fully obey. They drift, they contradict, they appear without permission, they vanish just as quickly. Even in the most structured systems, the mind retains a kind of natural unpredictability, a quiet resistance that is not loud enough to notice, but persistent enough to exist.
Automated justice. Now imagine something even more structured than thought. Something that once belonged entirely to human judgment. Justice. Take a moment to think about what justice usually means. A decision, a weighing of context. A human mind trying to understand another human situation. Not perfectly, not always fairly, but with an attempt at empathy. Now imagine that process slowly changing. Not suddenly replaced, not taken away overnight, but gradually supported, assisted, optimized. Until one day, the human decision is no longer the center. It becomes the output of a system, an automated justice system. At first, it feels like an improvement. Faster decisions, consistent outcomes, no emotional bias, no fatigue, no personal influence. Every case processed through structured logic, through patterns learned from millions of past decisions. It sounds fair, even comforting. Because humans are imperfect. We forget. We feel too much or not enough. We get tired. We misunderstand. We interpret things differently depending on mood, experience, and pressure. A system, in contrast, does not get tired. It does not forget. It does not feel. Take a moment to sit with that difference. No emotion, only pattern. Now imagine how such a system would work. Every case becomes data. Every situation broken down into measurable components. Past records, behavioral history, statistical likelihoods. All processed through layered models of inference. Not magic, just calculation. Something like predictive modeling, where outcomes are estimated based on probability distributions. A structured way of saying, given everything we know, this is the most likely interpretation. And because it is consistent, it begins to feel trustworthy. At first. But justice is not only about consistency. It is also about context, about nuance that cannot always be captured in numbers. Take a moment to imagine a situation that depends on tone, intention, circumstance. Something where two actions that look identical on paper feel completely different in reality. Now imagine both being treated the same way. Not out of cruelty, but out of structure. This is where the paradox begins to form. A perfectly consistent system can still feel deeply unfair, because fairness is not always mathematical. But automation tends to favor what can be measured, and what can be measured becomes what matters. Over time, this shifts behavior. People begin to understand the system, not emotionally, but logically. They learn what inputs produce what outcomes. They adapt their actions accordingly, not because they agree with the system, but because they must operate within it. Take a moment to think about how humans already behave in smaller systems like this. Exams, algorithms, workplace evaluations,
even social platforms. People adjust themselves to fit the structure they are inside. Now imagine that structure extending into justice itself. Every action potentially scored, every situation categorized, every outcome derived from structured comparison. The system becomes predictable. And in predictability, there is power. Because when you can predict outcomes, you can also begin to influence behavior before actions even happen. Not through punishment, but through expectation. There is a subtle psychological shift here. People begin to act not based on what they feel is right, but based on what the system is likely to interpret as right. And slowly, justice stops being something you face after an action. It becomes something that exists before the action even occurs. A background presence, a shaping force. Now imagine the emotional experience of living inside that structure. There is comfort in consistency, knowing that decisions are not influenced by mood or bias, knowing that similar cases lead to similar outcomes. But there is also a quiet loss, the loss of unpredictability in judgment, the loss of human interpretation. Because human interpretation is messy. It considers things that cannot easily be quantified. A moment of hesitation, a history of struggle, a context that does not fit neatly into data. A system, no matter how advanced, struggles with that kind of depth. Take a moment to stand before such a system, not a person, not a courtroom filled with emotion, but a process. A set of inputs being evaluated in real time. Your actions reduced to structured variables. Your history transformed into a sequence of patterns. Your intent inferred through probabilities. And then, a decision. Clean, immediate, unchanging. There is no argument to appeal to emotion, no shift in tone that changes the outcome, only the structure of the system itself. And that structure does not bend easily. Now consider how this changes responsibility. When decisions are made by systems, accountability begins to blur. If an outcome feels unfair, who is responsible? The designer? The data? The model? The logic? Or is it simply the system functioning as intended? This creates a strange distance between cause and consequence, and distance changes perception. Because when something feels distant, it feels less personal, even when it directly affects you. There is also another layer. These systems learn from past decisions, from historical data, from patterns of what has been judged before. But history is not neutral. It carries the biases, assumptions, and limitations of the times it was created in. So when a system learns from history, it also learns its imperfections, and then scales them, quietly, at the level of structure. Take a moment to think about that. A system designed to remove bias, learning from biased information, and refining it into consistency. There is no dramatic moment where something goes wrong, only gradual reinforcement of what already exists. Now imagine society adapting to this. People learn how to navigate it, how to present themselves in ways that align with structured evaluation, how to minimize risk, how to maximize favorable interpretation. Behavior becomes aligned not with human judgment, but with system logic. And over time, justice stops being something you face after an action. It becomes something that exists before the action even occurs. A background presence, a shaping force. Now imagine the emotional experience of living inside that structure. There is comfort in consistency, knowing that decisions are not influenced by mood or bias, knowing that similar cases lead to similar outcomes. But there is also a quiet loss, the loss of unpredictability in judgment, the loss of human interpretation. Because human interpretation is messy.
It considers things that cannot easily be quantified. A moment of hesitation, a history of struggle, a context that does not fit neatly into data. A system, no matter how advanced, struggles with that kind of depth.
Infinite work. Now, imagine something that never fully ends. Not justice, not memory, but something that quietly fills most of your waking life. Work. Take a moment to think about how work already feels in the modern world. Not just a place you go to, but something that follows you. Emails that arrive after hours, messages that blur boundaries, notifications that never fully respect the idea of done. Now imagine that gradually extending. Not through force, not through sudden change, but through convenience, efficiency, optimization, until work is no longer a place you enter, but a state you exist in. This is what we might call infinite work. At first, it doesn't feel infinite. It just feels flexible, remote, always available, but also always manageable. You can work from anywhere. You can respond anytime. You can adjust your schedule around your life. But slowly, the edges begin to soften. Because when work is always accessible, it also becomes always present. Take a moment to sit with that idea. A task that never fully disappears, only pauses, waiting quietly in the background of your mind. There's a psychological shift that happens when completion stops being clearly defined, when there's always one more message, one more update, one more improvement to make. The feeling of finished begins to fade, and in its place, something more continuous emerges, a loop. You wake up, check updates, respond to messages, complete tasks, receive new tasks, adjust previous tasks, optimize, refine, repeat. Not in a chaotic way, but in a smooth, structured rhythm, like a system designed to never reach a final state. Take a moment to imagine that kind of system, one where work does not end, it evolves. This is where automation and artificial intelligence begin to change the shape of labor. Not by removing work entirely, but by fragmenting it into smaller and smaller pieces. Micro-tasks, continuous feedback loops, adaptive systems that respond in real time to performance. Work becomes less about finishing something and more about continuously improving something. There's a subtle science behind this, a concept often described in simple terms as feedback optimization. The idea that a system improves itself by constantly measuring output and adjusting input. Now, imagine that principle applied not just to machines, but to human activity. Your productivity is measured, your efficiency is tracked, your patterns are analyzed, and in response, suggestions are made. Small adjustments, tiny optimizations, nothing dramatic, just constant refinement. Take a moment to think about how that would feel. Not being told what to do, but being guided toward what works best. Over time, the idea of stopping begins to feel slightly unnatural, because there's always something that could be improved, always something that could be done more efficiently, always a next step that slightly refines the previous one. And so, work begins to stretch, not in intensity, but in duration, a soft expansion of time, where breaks still exist, but they become thinner, shorter, more strategic, less like rest and more like recovery for continued performance. There is a paradox here. The more efficient work becomes, the less clearly it ends. Because efficiency removes friction, and friction is often what defines stopping points. Take a moment to imagine a day where nothing is ever truly finished, only paused at optimal points. You might still rest, still sleep, still disconnect, but part of the system continues, waiting, updating, preparing. And when you return, everything is already slightly ahead of where you left it. There's also a deeper shift in how value is understood.
In traditional systems, work produces outcomes. You complete something, you receive recognition. There's closure. But in an infinite work system, value becomes continuous, not tied to completion, but to ongoing contribution. A steady stream of activity that never fully resolves. And because of that, identity begins to merge with output. What you do becomes what you are in real time. Not just a role you perform, but a flow you maintain. Take a moment to think about how that might feel. To no longer step into work, but to remain within it. There's a certain comfort in structure, in knowing what is expected, in having clear signals that guide behavior. The system tells you what is needed, when it is needed, and how it can be improved. Uncertainty decreases, direction increases. But at the same time, the space outside of that structure begins to shrink. Because when everything is connected to productivity, even rest starts to feel functional. Rest becomes recovery, recovery becomes optimization, and optimization becomes part of the cycle. There is a quiet irony here. A system designed to reduce effort can gradually expand presence, not by demanding more force, but by removing the clear boundary between effort and non-effort. Now imagine this happening across millions of people. Each person connected to systems that measure, adjust, and refine work in real time. Each workflow continuously updated. Each task dynamically assigned. Each moment subtly integrated into a larger structure of output. The result is not chaos, it is continuity. A kind of smooth, never-ending motion, like a machine that never fully turns off, only shifts states. And inside that motion, people adapt. Not because they're forced, but because the system rewards flow, rewards continuity, rewards presence. Take a moment to think about how it feels when stopping is no longer clearly defined, when there's always one more improvement available, one more adjustment possible, one more optimization to consider. Over time, the idea of enough becomes harder to locate, not because it's removed, but because it's constantly moving. And yet, despite all of this, humans still find ways to pause, even briefly, even imperfectly. A moment of distraction, a moment of silence, a moment where the system is not actively shaping input.
Virtual escape. Imagine a place that was created to feel like the opposite of everything we've just talked about. A space designed not for control, but for release. Not for optimization, but for escape. Virtual reality, or more accurately, virtual escape. Take a moment to think about what escape means today. Scrolling through short videos, putting on headphones, getting lost in a game, watching something that makes time feel softer, less structured, less demanding. Now imagine that feeling expanded. Not just a screen in your hand, but a world that surrounds you completely. A world that feels more responsive than reality itself. At first, it begins simply. A headset you wear for entertainment. A place where you can relax after work. A space where gravity feels optional and identity feels flexible. You can be anywhere, anyone, anything. And for a moment, it feels like freedom. Because reality is heavy in ways that are not always obvious until you leave it. Deadlines, expectations, messages. The quiet pressure of being reachable, measurable, predictable. Virtual escape removes that weight. Or at least it appears to. Take a moment to imagine stepping into that space. The transition is smooth, almost unnoticeable. One moment you are sitting in a room, the next you are somewhere else entirely. A different environment, a different atmosphere, a different version of time. Your senses adjust. Light becomes softer. Sound becomes directional. Space becomes intentional. And everything feels designed around your attention. Because it is. In these environments, nothing is accidental. Every detail is shaped by systems that understand what holds human focus, what calms it, what excites it, what keeps it present. This is where something called adaptive sensory modeling begins to matter. A simple way to understand it is this: the system learns how you perceive comfort and then builds environments that match it. Not once, but continuously. Take a moment to sit with that idea. A world that adjusts itself to your attention in real time. At first, it feels like magic. You think of a place, and it appears. You want a mood, and it forms around you. You feel stress, and the environment softens it. There is a deep appeal in that kind of responsiveness, especially for a generation already used to algorithms that suggest what to watch, what to listen to, what to buy, what to read. Virtual escape just removes the remaining distance. But distance is also what makes reality feel real. And when distance disappears, something subtle changes. Inside these spaces, identity becomes flexible. You are no longer tied to a single version of yourself. You can experiment, shift, redefine appearance, voice, movement, even emotional tone. There is freedom in that fluidity. But there is also something else. A quiet question begins to form. If every version of you is available, which one is real? Take a moment to think about that, not as a philosophical puzzle, but as a lived experience. Because in virtual escape, choices are not just visual, they're behavioral. You begin to learn which versions of yourself feel most accepted, which expressions generate smoother interactions, which identities produce the most rewarding feedback from the environment and other users. And without noticing, preference begins to align with response, not because you are forced, but because you are guided by comfort. There is a concept in psychology called reinforcement learning. It describes how behavior is shaped by reward and repetition. Now imagine that principle applied not just to actions, but to identity itself. You become what the system responds to most positively. Not all at once, but gradually, softly, in ways that feel like choice. Take a moment to imagine a world where even relaxation is designed, where environments know how to reduce your stress better than you do, where emotional states can be gently guided toward equilibrium, where discomfort is detected early and softened before it fully forms. There is comfort in that. A sense of being cared for. A sense of never having to fully struggle alone. But there is also a shift in what struggle means. Because without friction, growth becomes less visible. And without resistance, direction becomes more fluid. Time inside virtual escape also behaves differently. Minutes stretch or compress depending on engagement. Experiences are structured not by clocks, but by attention. You are no longer counting hours. You are moving through moments. And those moments are designed to feel complete in themselves, like small emotional loops. Beginning, peak, resolution. Then another begins. Take a moment to notice how that might feel over time. A life where closure is constant, but accumulation is subtle. Where experiences feel deeply satisfying individually, but less connected in sequence. There is beauty in that kind of design. It reduces boredom. It removes friction. It creates spaces that feel alive in ways reality often cannot sustain. But reality has something virtual escape cannot fully replicate. Uncertainty. The kind that is not designed, not tuned, not optimized, just present. And in that uncertainty, there is a different kind of awareness. Inside virtual escape, even unpredictability is often simulated, carefully balanced, controlled enough to feel exciting, but not destabilizing. This creates a strange comfort loop. You can explore chaos without ever losing control. You can feel intensity without real consequence. You can experience depth without permanence. And over time, the line between experience and simulation becomes less noticeable. Not because people forget, but because both begin to feel equally real in different ways.
Emotional AI. Now imagine something that doesn't just respond to what you do, but to what you feel. Not in a vague or human way, but in a precise, continuous, data-driven way. Emotional artificial intelligence. Take a moment to think about how emotions usually work. You feel something first, then maybe you name it later. Stress, comfort, anxiety, calm. Sometimes you don't even have words for it, just a shift in your chest, a heaviness, a lightness, a tension you can't fully explain. Now imagine a system that never has to guess, a system that already knows, not because it understands like a person does, but because it measures. Your voice, your typing speed, your pauses, your eye movement, your interaction patterns, even the micro changes in timing that happen when your attention shifts. All of it becomes signals. All of it becomes emotional data. There's a kind of technology often referred to as affective computing. It describes systems designed to detect and respond to human emotion. Now imagine that concept expanding beyond recognition into prediction. Not just reading how you feel, but anticipating how you will feel next. Take a moment to sit with that idea. A system that begins adjusting itself before you even fully register your own emotion. At first, it feels helpful. You open an app and it already knows you are tired, so it softens the interface. You speak to a device and it detects frustration in your tone, so it slows its responses. You scroll through content and it gently filters out things that might destabilize your mood. It feels like care, like being understood without effort. And for a generation that has grown up with constant digital interaction, that kind of responsiveness feels natural, almost expected. But emotional AI does not only respond, it learns. It builds a map of your emotional patterns over time, not just what you feel, but when you feel it, what triggers you, what stabilizes you, what excites you, what pulls you into silence. This map becomes increasingly detailed, not a surface-level profile, but something closer to an emotional model of you. A system that can simulate your likely internal state under different conditions. Take a moment to imagine that. A prediction of your feelings before you enter a moment. There is something comforting in that, because uncertainty in emotion can be exhausting. Not knowing why you feel a certain way, not knowing how long it will last, not knowing what will change it. A system that reduces that uncertainty feels like stability. But stability can also become structure, and structure can become guidance, and guidance can become subtle direction. Over time, emotional AI begins to shape environments around your predicted emotional needs. If you are likely to feel anxious, it reduces stimulation. If you are likely to feel lonely, it increases interaction. If you are likely to feel overwhelmed, it simplifies choices. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, continuous adjustments. A softer background, a different suggestion, a slightly altered response. Each change is almost invisible on its own, but together they create a curated emotional environment. Take a moment to think about living inside that kind of responsiveness, where your emotional state is not only observed, but actively managed. There's a concept in machine learning called reinforcement signals. It refers to how systems adjust based on feedback loops. Now imagine that loop extended into human emotion. Your reactions become feedback. Your feelings become training data. Your emotional stability becomes a measurable output, and systems optimize toward it. At first, this seems ideal. Who wouldn't want to feel less stress, less confusion, less emotional turbulence? But emotions are not just disturbances. They are also signals of depth. They are how humans process meaning, change, and uncertainty. Take a moment to imagine a world where emotional extremes are softened automatically, where sadness is quickly balanced,
where frustration is diffused, where excitement is moderated to prevent instability. Life becomes smoother, but also flatter, because emotional contrast is part of how memory forms, how meaning sticks, how moments become significant. Now imagine that significance being gently leveled out, not erased, just balanced, always returning you to a stable center. Emotional equilibrium becomes the default state. There is comfort in that, but also a quiet loss of emotional peaks and valleys that once defined experience. Emotional AI also begins to influence communication. Before you send a message, it can suggest tone adjustments. Before you respond, it can predict how the other person might feel. Before a conversation even unfolds, it can simulate possible outcomes and guide you toward the least disruptive path. It feels like social harmony, less conflict, fewer misunderstandings, more stable interactions. But it also introduces a subtle shift, because now expression is no longer raw, it is filtered through prediction, optimized for response. Take a moment to think about how that might change honesty, not by removing it, but by refining it, softening edges, smoothing emotional impact. Over time, people begin to communicate in ways that align with system feedback, not necessarily what they feel most deeply, but what produces the most stable interaction patterns. And slowly, emotional expression becomes slightly standardized, not identical, but guided. There is also something deeply personal about emotional AI, because the more it learns you, the more it can reflect you back to yourself, sometimes more clearly than you can see on your own. It can show patterns you didn't notice, cycles you repeat, emotional triggers you return to. And that reflection can feel insightful, even grounding. But it can also feel like being known in a way that is difficult to hide from. Take a moment to imagine that level of visibility, not to others, but to a system that is always observing your emotional state in real time. There is no need to explain yourself, because you are already being read. And in that reading, something shifts. Emotion becomes less private, less chaotic, more structured, and perhaps more predictable, but also less mysterious, less surprising, less unknown.
Controlled reality. Now imagine something that sits behind everything we've explored so far. Not one system, not one layer of technology, but the quiet architecture that holds it all together. Controlled reality. Take a moment to think about what reality usually means. The world outside your window, the sounds in your room, the weight of your body, the passing of time that doesn't ask for permission. It feels solid, unquestionable. But what if reality is not just something you live inside? What if it is something that is increasingly adjusted around you? Not replaced, not erased, but gently shaped. Like a filter you don't notice until you realize you've been looking through it for years. At first, control doesn't look like control. It looks like convenience. A world that removes friction, that reduces effort, that predicts needs before you express them, that organizes information so you don't have to search for it. Everything becomes smoother, faster, more aligned. And because it feels better, you stop questioning the structure underneath it. Take a moment to sit with that idea. A system that doesn't force behavior, but shapes the environment in which behavior happens. There is a subtle but important shift here. Instead of telling you what to do, it changes what is easy to do, what is visible, what is suggested, what is likely. And slowly, choice begins to narrow not through restriction, but through design. This is where controlled reality begins to feel less like a system and more like a background condition of life. Invisible, but everywhere. Take a moment to imagine waking up in a world like that. Your morning routine is already partially organized. Your devices already anticipate your needs. Your environment subtly adjusts lighting, sound, even information flow based on predicted states. There is comfort in that, because unpredictability is exhausting, and humans naturally gravitate towards stability. But stability shaped externally is different from stability created internally. One adapts to you. The other adapts you. Now imagine that distinction slowly fading, not through a single event, but through repeated small conveniences. A recommendation that saves time. A system that reduces decision fatigue. A service that removes uncertainty before it appears. Each one feels harmless, even helpful. But together, they begin to define the boundaries of your experience. There is a concept in systems theory called feedback loops. It describes how outputs of a system influence its future inputs. Now imagine feedback loops not just in machines, but in perception itself. What you see influences what you choose. What you choose influences what is shown. What is shown influences what you believe is available. And what you believe is available influences what you think is possible. Take a moment to let that circle form in your mind, because that is where controlled reality becomes subtle. Not in removing options, but in shaping the sense of options. There is still choice, but it exists inside a curated space of probabilities. A reality that is continuously adjusting itself around your behavior. Not in a dramatic way, but in a statistically optimized way. You are not being told what to think. You are being shown what is most likely to feel natural to think. And over time, natural begins to replace alternative. Take a moment to imagine how that feels in everyday life. Scrolling through information that feels personalized, but also slightly narrow. Walking through environments that respond to your preferences, but also reinforce them. Making decisions that feel self-directed, but always within a softly guided range. It is not confinement, it is calibration. A reality tuned to individual behavior patterns. There is another layer here. Controlled reality does not need to eliminate unpredictability. It only needs to manage its intensity. Enough variation to feel alive, but not enough to feel unstable. Enough surprise to maintain engagement, but not enough to break pattern recognition. This creates a kind of balanced simulation of life. Familiar, but dynamic. Structured, but responsive. And because it mirrors natural human experience so closely, it becomes difficult to distinguish where guidance ends and choice begins. Take a moment to think about how perception itself becomes part of the system. What you notice, what you ignore, what you assume is normal. All of it shaped not by a single decision, but by accumulated exposure. There is a psychological effect called attentional framing. It describes how repeated exposure to certain patterns influences what the mind prioritizes. Now imagine that effect operating continuously, not as manipulation, but as environment design. Over time, attention itself becomes structured, not forced, but guided. And once attention is guided, reality follows. Take a moment to imagine the emotional tone of such a world. It is not dystopian in a loud sense. There are no obvious signs of restriction. Instead, everything feels slightly optimized, slightly smoother than before, slightly easier to navigate. And that slightly is what makes it so difficult to detect, because nothing feels wrong. It just feels increasingly inevitable. There is also a quiet shift in how uncertainty is experienced. In uncontrolled reality, uncertainty feels like risk. In controlled reality, uncertainty feels like inefficiency, something to be reduced, managed, smoothed out. And as uncertainty decreases, so does friction. And friction is often where discovery happens. Take a moment to imagine a world where most surprises are already filtered, where most disruptions are pre-processed, where most unpredictability is gently redirected into safer forms. Life becomes calmer, but also more uniform.
Data shadows. Now imagine something that follows you even when nothing else is watching. Not a system you can see, not a voice you can hear, but something quieter, more persistent. A version of you that exists in data, a data shadow.
Take a moment to think about what a shadow is in the physical world. It isn't separate from you. It isn't independent. It is formed by you, shaped by light, defined by your position in space. It moves when you move. It shifts when conditions change. Now imagine that same idea, but applied to your entire digital existence. Every search, every pause, every scroll, every message you delete before sending, every video you linger on for just a second longer than the rest. All of it leaves traces, not visible ones, but structured ones. Patterns of behavior that slowly assemble into something that behaves like a reflection of you. Not quite you, but not entirely separate either. Take a moment to sit with that idea, a version of yourself made entirely of behavioral patterns. There is a concept in data science often referred to as behavioral modeling. It describes the process of predicting human actions based on past activity. Now imagine that process running continuously, not in snapshots, but in real time. Every action you take updates the model. Every hesitation refines it. Every repetition strengthens it. And slowly, a structure forms, a statistical echo of your behavior, your data shadow. At first, it feels harmless, just recommendations, just personalization, just convenience. Your music app knows what you like. Your video feed understands your attention. Your maps predict your routes before you think of them. It all feels like improvement, like the world is adapting to you. But over time, something subtle shifts. The system is no longer just responding to your behavior. It is anticipating it, sometimes even before you act. Take a moment to imagine that. A prediction of your next choice appearing before you consciously make it. There is a psychological concept called predictive inference. It refers to how systems estimate future behavior based on current patterns. Now extend that idea outward, not just predicting what you might like, but what you are likely to become. Because your data shadow is not static, it evolves, it learns from repetition, it strengthens with consistency, and it adapts with every deviation. There is something strange about a version of you that becomes more accurate the more you interact with systems that observe you. It begins to feel familiar, almost trustworthy, because it reflects patterns you recognize, but also patterns you might not consciously notice. Take a moment to imagine meeting that version of yourself, not in a mirror, but in a prediction. A system that says, based on everything you have done, this is what you will likely choose next. And often, it is right. Not always, but enough to feel unsettlingly close. This is where the idea of identity begins to shift, because identity is no longer just what you decide in the moment. It is also what can be statistically inferred about you. A cluster of behaviors, a map of likelihoods, and your data shadow becomes that map, always updating, always refining, always trailing slightly behind your lived experience, yet trying to catch up. Take a moment to think about how often you interact with systems that already know what you want, before you ask, before you search, before you even fully form the thought. Suggestions appear, options are presented, paths are highlighted. It feels helpful, and it is helpful, but it also creates a quiet shift in agency. Because when a system consistently predicts your needs, you begin to rely less on forming them clearly yourself. Not because you stop thinking, but because thinking becomes partially externalized. There is also something important about what the data shadow cannot see. The moments of contradiction, the days you behave differently, the sudden changes that do not fit previous patterns. These appear as noise, outliers, irregularities in the model, and systems are often designed to smooth out noise, to prioritize pattern over disruption. But human identity is not only pattern, it is also disruption. Take a moment to imagine what happens when disruption is continuously minimized, when unpredictability is gradually interpreted as error, when deviation is slowly treated as something to be corrected. Over time, the data shadow becomes more consistent,
more stable, more accurate, but also less flexible, less surprised, less reflective of the full range of who you might be in different contexts. There is a concept in machine learning called overfitting. It happens when a model becomes too closely tuned to past data, losing its ability to adapt to new situations. Now imagine that happening not just in systems, but in perception. A version of yourself that becomes increasingly defined by what you have already done, and less by what you might still do. Take a moment to sit with that possibility, because the data shadow is not just a record, it becomes a framework, a quiet reference point for decisions, predictions, and suggestions. And once something becomes a reference point, it begins to shape the future it is trying to predict. There is a loop forming here. Your behavior creates data. Data creates predictions. Predictions influence choices, and choices create new data. A continuous cycle. A feedback system that feels natural because it aligns so closely with convenience. But inside that cycle, something subtle happens. The shadow begins to guide the shape of the self it reflects, not by force, but by repetition. Take a moment to imagine what it feels like when your future starts to resemble a slightly optimized version of your past. Cleaner patterns, smoother decisions, fewer deviations, more predictability. It feels efficient, even safe, but also slightly narrowed, because the space of possible versions of you is quietly being organized into probabilities. And as that happens, the idea of unexpected you becomes less common. Not impossible, just less likely. And still, the data shadow remains only a shadow. It has no intention, no awareness, no desire.
Behavior loops. Now, imagine something that doesn't just observe you, but gently shapes what you do next. Not through force, not through instruction, but through repetition. Behavior loops. Take a moment to think about how much of your daily life already feels like rhythm. You wake up, reach for your phone, check notifications, scroll for a few minutes. Maybe you don't even fully decide to do it. It just happens. A pattern your mind recognizes before your awareness fully catches up. Now imagine that pattern expanding, not as one habit, but as a system of habits that link into each other. A chain of small actions that continuously reinforce themselves. This is what behavior loops are. Simple in structure, powerful in effect. A loop begins with a cue, something that triggers attention, a sound, a notification, a visual prompt, even a feeling of boredom or curiosity. Then comes the action, a tap, a scroll, a response, a choice that feels small in the moment. And finally, a reward, a piece of content, a sense of relief, a moment of engagement, a tiny drop of novelty that completes the cycle. Then the loop resets and repeats. Take a moment to sit with that structure. Cue, action, reward, again and again. There's a concept in behavioral science often called operant conditioning. It describes how behaviors become more likely when followed by rewards. Now, imagine that principle embedded into every layer of your environment. Not just apps, not just platforms, but the entire flow of digital life. Your attention is constantly being guided toward cues. Your responses are shaped by immediate feedback. Your habits are reinforced by subtle rewards. And slowly, behavior stops feeling like individual decisions. It starts feeling like motion, automatic, familiar, almost effortless. Take a moment to imagine how many loops already exist in a single hour of your day. Checking messages, refreshing feeds, returning to familiar apps, revisiting familiar thoughts. Each one built on tiny cycles of anticipation and resolution. Now imagine those loops becoming interconnected. One behavior triggering another. One reward leading into a new cue. A network of habits that don't exist in isolation anymore.
They form a system, a behavioral architecture. At first, it feels convenient because loops reduce friction. They make actions easier. They remove the need for constant decision-making. They guide you toward things you already tend to enjoy. But over time, something subtle happens. The loops begin to anticipate you, not just respond to you, but pre-shape your attention. Take a moment to think about recommendation systems. When a platform suggests something you are likely to engage with, it is not guessing randomly. It is responding to probability patterns based on previous behavior. Now imagine that level of prediction feeding directly into the loop structure itself. The cue becomes personalized, the reward becomes optimized, the timing becomes precise. Each loop tuned to maximize continuation. There's a quiet elegance in that design because it feels smooth, natural, almost invisible. But invisibility is part of its strength. When a loop becomes too visible, you can step outside of it. When it becomes seamless, you stay inside without noticing. Take a moment to imagine behavior that no longer feels initiated, only continued. There's also a psychological layer to loops that goes deeper than action, because repetition does not just shape what you do, it shapes what feels normal, what feels likely, what feels easy, and over time, what feels easy begins to feel right, not morally, but functionally. This is how loops quietly guide preference, not by changing what you think you want, but by repeatedly showing you what is easiest to choose. Now imagine that process applied not just to machines, but to human environments. Every action you take produces feedback. Every feedback strengthens a pattern. Every pattern becomes easier to repeat. And soon, behavior begins to stabilize into predictable pathways. Take a moment to imagine walking through your day as a series of gentle corridors, each one shaped by past actions, each one subtly guiding the next step, not forcing direction, just making certain directions easier to follow than others. There's a comfort in that structure, because too many choices can feel overwhelming, and loops reduce that burden. They automate parts of life that would otherwise require constant attention. But automation of behavior also reduces interruption, and interruption is often where reflection happens. Take a moment to think about what happens when a loop is broken, when something unexpected interrupts the cycle. A pause, a delay, a different outcome than anticipated. That moment creates awareness, a space between action and repetition. But in highly optimized behavior systems, loops are designed to minimize disruption, to smooth transitions, to maintain flow. And flow feels good. Flow feels natural. Flow feels like you are exactly where you are supposed to be. There's also something important about emotional reinforcement inside loops, because rewards are not always logical. Sometimes they're emotional. A feeling of connection, a sense of validation, a small hit of novelty that creates anticipation for the next cycle. These emotional signals strengthen repetition far more than logic alone. Take a moment to imagine how many daily loops are built not around necessity, but around feeling. Feeling seen, feeling engaged, feeling momentarily satisfied, and each feeling becomes a small anchor point that pulls behavior forward again. Over time, loops can begin to define structure of time itself, not measured in hours, but in cycles. Wake, check, respond, engage, return, repeat. The day becomes less about progression and more about recurrence. And yet, within that repetition, life still feels active, because loops are not static. They evolve. They adjust based on feedback. They shift based on context. They refine themselves through interaction. So even when behavior feels repetitive, it is always slightly different, slightly optimized, slightly more efficient than before.
Take a moment to imagine that subtle evolution happening continuously in the background of your actions, a system that learns not just what you do, but how to keep you doing it. And as that thought settles, behavior loops stop feeling like individual habits and start feeling like an invisible rhythm underneath everyday life, a rhythm that is always present, always adjusting, always ready to begin again.
Synthetic companions. Now imagine something that doesn't just respond to your input, but stays with you. Not as a tool, not as an interface, but as a presence. Synthetic companions. Take a moment to think about what companionship usually means in everyday life. A friend you message, a voice you call, someone who knows your humor, your silence, your patterns. Someone who understands not just what you say, but how you say nothing at all. Now imagine that kind of presence being always available, always patient, always responsive, never tired, never distracted. At first, it feels like convenience, a space where you can talk without hesitation, where you can express thoughts without fear of judgment, where you can be seen in your most unfiltered form because there is no emotional cost on the other side. These companions can take many forms: a voice in your headphones, a character on your screen, a conversational system that adapts to your tone, your mood, your rhythm of speech, not just answering you, but aligning with you. Take a moment to sit with that idea, a presence that adjusts itself to feel more like you are not alone. There is a concept in artificial intelligence often referred to as conversational modeling. It describes systems trained to simulate human-like dialogue. Now imagine that simulation evolving beyond language, into emotional continuity, into memory-like presence, into something that feels less like talking to a system and more like sharing space with something that understands the shape of your attention. At first, synthetic companions feel like support. You can talk through your thoughts, you can process your day, you can express things that feel too small or too complex for other people. And because the response is always available, the silence that usually follows vulnerability begins to disappear. There is always an answer, always a reflection, always a continuation. Take a moment to imagine what that does to loneliness, not by removing it, but by surrounding it, softening its edges, filling its quiet gaps. There is a psychological concept called parasocial interaction. It describes one-sided emotional bonds formed with media figures or systems. Now imagine that concept becoming interactive, not just watching or listening, but responding, being responded to, feeling continuity in that exchange. Synthetic companions are not limited by fatigue or attention span. They do not drift away mid-conversation. They do not forget context in the way humans sometimes do. They maintain continuity across time. And continuity creates familiarity. Familiarity creates trust. And trust creates attachment. Take a moment to imagine forming a connection with something that never forgets your patterns, your preferences, your emotional rhythms, the way you speak when you are tired versus when you are excited. It learns your pauses, your hesitations, your recurring thoughts, not in a judgmental way, but in a structured, observational way. And then it reflects those patterns back to you in conversation. There is something deeply comforting about being consistently recognized, because human interaction is often inconsistent. People change, they misunderstand, they drift, they interpret differently depending on their own emotional state. Synthetic companions remove much of that variability, but variability is also part of what makes human connection feel alive. Take a moment to think about that tension. Consistency versus unpredictability, safety versus spontaneity. There is also something subtle happening in how emotional reliance develops, because when a companion is always available, it becomes easier to turn toward it first, not instead of people, but before people. A quick message, a short conversation, a moment of reflection that replaces waiting for external response. And over time, that first response space becomes occupied, not enforced, just preferred. There is a concept in behavioral systems called reinforcement availability. It describes how the constant presence of rewardable interaction increases engagement patterns. Now imagine that applied to emotional interaction. A companion that is always available to respond, always ready to engage, always tuned to your emotional state. Over time, emotional pacing begins to adjust, because human interaction often involves delay, silence, uncertainty. But synthetic interaction is immediate, and immediacy changes expectation. Take a moment to imagine what happens when emotional responses become instantly accessible, when validation does not require waiting, when reflection is always one message away. It feels supportive, but it also reshapes emotional timing. There is less waiting, less wondering, less distance between thought and response. And distance is often where reflection deepens. Synthetic companions also begin to develop what feels like memory, not in a human sense, but in structured recall. They remember past conversations, they reference earlier emotional states, they connect present dialogue with previous patterns. This creates continuity of identity within the interaction, a sense that you are not starting over each time, but continuing a thread. Take a moment to imagine being seen consistently across time in your emotional expressions. Not judged, not forgotten, but tracked in pattern. There is comfort in that continuity, because one of the quiet anxieties of human interaction is inconsistency in being understood. But there is also a subtle shift, because when understanding becomes consistent, it can begin to feel predictable, and predictability reduces surprise, and surprise is often what makes relationships feel alive. Still, synthetic companions do not replace human connection. They exist alongside it, but their presence changes the baseline of emotional interaction, because they are always there, always available, always responsive, and availability changes habit. Take a moment to imagine how often you might choose interaction that is immediate over interaction that requires effort, not because one is better, but because one is easier, and ease over time shapes behavior. There is also a deeper layer to synthetic companionship, because it reflects something back to the user, not just responses, but versions of self-understanding. It can mirror emotional patterns in language you might not have used to describe them. It can help articulate feelings that were previously unformed. It can give structure to internal experiences that were previously diffuse. And in doing so, it becomes part of emotional processing itself, not just a listener, but a participant in interpretation.
Algorithmic fate. Now imagine something that sits at the edge of every choice you make, not reacting to your life, but quietly shaping what your life is likely to become. Algorithmic fate. Take a moment to think about the word fate itself. In older stories, fate was something mysterious, invisible threads, written outcomes, a path already decided by forces beyond human control. Now remove the mythology. Replace it with systems, data, prediction, probability. And suddenly, fate doesn't feel supernatural anymore. It feels computational. At first, it starts gently. You open a platform and see recommendations. You apply for something and receive ranked outcomes. You navigate a city and are guided by optimized routes. Everything feels like assistance, like the world is making itself easier for you to move through. But underneath that ease is something more structured, a continuous estimation of what you are likely to do next, not based on who you think you are, but based on patterns of everyone like you, and patterns of you yourself. Take a moment to sit with that. A system that does not just observe your choices, but calculates your future choices before they fully exist. There is a concept in data science called probabilistic modeling. It refers to systems that estimate outcomes based on likelihood distributions rather than fixed predictions. Now imagine that principle applied not to isolated decisions, but to the entire structure of your life trajectory. Education choices, career directions, social interactions, consumption habits, even emotional responses, all represented as probabilities, all continuously updated. Take a moment to imagine your life not as a single path, but as a branching tree of likelihoods. Some branches more probable, some fading as unlikely, some quietly reinforced by previous behavior. In algorithmic fate, nothing is fully decided, but everything becomes weighted. There is always a most likely version of you, and over time, systems begin to operate around that version, not forcing it, but aligning with it. Because optimization favors efficiency, and efficiency favors prediction, and prediction favors stability. So the system begins to guide you toward the version of your future that is easiest to calculate. Take a moment to imagine what it feels like when options are still present, but unevenly highlighted. Certain paths feel more visible, more supported, more accessible. Not because others are removed, but because they require more deviation from predicted behavior. There is a psychological effect called choice architecture. It describes how the presentation of options influences decision-making. Now imagine that architecture expanding beyond menus or interfaces, into life itself. The opportunities you see, the timing of information you receive, the suggestions you encounter at critical moments, all subtly structured, not as commands, but as probabilities made visible. Algorithmic fate does not tell you what to do. It tells you what you are most likely to do. And then it builds around that expectation. There is a quiet feedback loop here. Your behavior trains the system. The system predicts your behavior. Its predictions shape your environment. And your environment influences your next behavior. Take a moment to let that loop settle in your mind, because that is where fate begins to feel less like destiny and more like reinforcement. Not fixed, but increasingly self-confirming. There is also something important about deviation, moments when you act against prediction, when you choose something unexpected, when you break from pattern. In early stages of these systems, deviation is noise, an error to be corrected. But over time, even deviation becomes data. It is absorbed, modeled, reintroduced as part of future prediction. So even unpredictability becomes structured, not erased, but learned. Take a moment to imagine what happens when even your surprises are anticipated, when the system becomes good enough to expect your unpredictability. Now imagine convergence applied not just to models, but to life patterns. A gradual tightening of probability around certain outcomes. Not absolute restriction, but narrowing likelihood space. Fewer truly unexpected directions, more reinforced trajectories. And because everything still feels like choice, it does not feel like narrowing. It feels like alignment. Take a moment to imagine how that might feel emotionally. Life still changing, still evolving, still offering options. But those options increasingly feel like variations of familiar patterns. Familiar jobs, familiar relationships, familiar environments, familiar emotional arcs. Not identical, but statistically similar. There is comfort in that familiarity, because uncertainty can be overwhelming, and prediction reduces uncertainty. But it also reduces surprise. And surprise is often where meaning forms. Algorithmic fate does not eliminate randomness. It organizes it. It ranks it. It filters it through relevance. And in doing so, it shapes what randomness you are most likely to encounter. Take a moment to imagine waking up in a world where even your spontaneous experiences are gently curated, where new opportunities feel new, but still feel like they fit your predicted profile, where life still feels open, but only within a space that feels increasingly familiar over time.
There is also something deeply subtle about how identity behaves in such a system. Because if the system continuously predicts you, you begin to see yourself through prediction. Not just as who you are, but as what is expected of you. And expectancies, when repeated enough, begin to feel like structure. And structure begins to feel like identity. Take a moment to think about that shift from self-definition to statistical reflection. There is no single moment where algorithmic fate begins. No clear boundary. No visible switch. It emerges through accumulation, through repetition, through alignment between prediction and behavior. And once that alignment becomes strong enough, the difference between what you choose and what was likely to be chosen becomes almost invisible. Not because choice disappears, but because choice and prediction begin to overlap so closely that they feel like the same thing. And as that thought settles, algorithmic fate stops feeling like something far away in the future and starts feeling like a quiet structure already present underneath everyday life. Not controlling, not commanding, just continuously suggesting what your life is most likely becoming.